and thank you for listening to Memoria's 6-series podcast, The Loss of a Loved One. After the most difficult of years, we have created this series to help those who have been directly impacted by the loss of a close family member, perhaps a good friend, or even a member of their own local community. In the previous episode, we looked at the impact and the effect going forward for those living with loss and discussed the help that is available to them. In this, the second episode, we will address just what happens when somebody dies, the processes, legal formalities, what choices a family had. In the third episode, we will look at the complexities of grieving and bereavement. The past year has had a profound effect on the funeral industry, and in episode 4 we will look at the history of funerals, what the last year has changed in the industry, and discuss funerals of the future. The last 20 years has seen significant changes in attitudes and approach to end-of-life services. So in the 5th episode we will look at the role of officiants, celebrants, religion, cultural needs, humanist options, and whether we are seeing an increase in family-conducted funerals. The final episode in this mini-series will be about hope. My name is Frank Meilack, and it's my honour to be the Director of Community Engagement at Memoria Limited. My role is self-descripted in its title, but part of my role is to engage with communities across the UK on this often difficult subject matter, to open the discussions and to create awareness of the choices and processes involved in end-of-life services. Today, I would like again to introduce the CEO of Memoria, Howard Hodgson. Howard, as today we are talking about the formalities and processes that must be fulfilled following a loved one passing, perhaps this is a good point to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a little bit about your own history in the funeral industry.
Okay, I am a fourth-generation funeral director. I was born and brought up in Birmingham, where our family funeral business started in 1850. And in fact, actually, I bought my father out in 1975. He was an excellent, very good funeral director, but in fact his business had shrunk considerably because of 1960s demolition. And how do you explain that? Well, no houses equals no people equals no deaths equals no funerals. So his business had shrunk considerably. And I bought him out and determined to build it up again. And actually, I wasn't really going to build an empire. I was trying to save it from going bankrupt. But actually, it grew into a very big company, which became Hodgson Holdings PLC, was floated on the stock market. It is today known as Dignity, but I sold my shares out in that in about 1990 and beginning of 91. And in fact, then I started Memoria. And in fact, in 2003, having had a few years away being actually chief executive of Ronson and then Calibri. And then I came back and started Memoria. And Memoria has been built as both a crematorium company and a online funeral business, really to support the looking after of bereaved people, because in fact bereavement is the most unhappy, awful experience that we will face in our lives. Some people actually say, oh, the most stressful is house purchase or divorce. It's not. It's actually losing a wife, losing a parent, or God forbid, losing a child. Those things are really very difficult experiences. And you can't take away the pain of bereavement, but what you can do is try and give people 5-star standards of service and facility, and give them diverse choice so that they can meet their own budgets and look after them. Do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Treat people like you'd like to be treated when you are bereaved. That is our aim, and I think it's also our achievement. And it is something which is a vacation rather than a money-making exercise. Of course, it's commercially sensible to do the job properly, but actually it's also important to do the job properly for the benefit of the people that you're serving, because there for the grace of God go you.
Fair to say, until the outbreak of COVID-19, the basic procedures that one had to follow after a loved one passed away was getting the doctor's paperwork in order, confirming events, and then registering the death at your local town hall registrar. That changed, did it not, with the emergency legislation that the government has put in place at the outset of this pandemic? Can you tell us a bit more about that, Howard?
Yeah, well, what's happened really was that the requirements prior to the pandemic were actually very Dickensian. They were everything as you've just described. Whereas the pandemic meant that people really couldn't wander around the streets or go into offices if it could be avoided. And so, in fact, suddenly you made appointments with the registrar and they phoned you up and they registered the death over the telephone. And in fact, you got the doctor's papers. They took two doctors. They took the second doctor away and they made the first doctor, in fact, allowed to send his first doctor's papers electronically over so that they could be accepted by coming over the crematoria's computer rather than actually having to be in a situation of delivered paper by hand, etc. So all of these things actually were an improvement, and I very much hope when the pandemic's over they won't come back. The old habits won't come back because they're not only cutting down rainforests to make all this paper that isn't needed, but actually it's much more efficient and much more convenient for families who asked to do, or were asked to do, a tremendous amount of things in terms of registering deaths and making funeral arrangements and actually getting grants of probate and trying to get everybody's affairs in order. It's a very, very tall order, just at a time when you're very upset.
Thank you. It's very insightful. Once you've fulfilled these formalities and you're able to make funeral arrangements, the recent adversities of the pandemic have meant that people have turned perhaps more to the internet, or they were either unable to find a local provider, perhaps there were capacity issues, and they just couldn't find a solution. Howard, could you tell our listeners how things have evolved during the pandemic in making alternative arrangements online during the past 12 months?
Yeah, they have changed a lot. I mean, it was already starting to happen, Frank, in a way, probably since about 2016, 2017. People were using the social media and the internet more to actually make purchases, and that even extended to funerals, but in quite a minor way. Whereas, thanks to the pandemic and lockdowns in particular, everybody's shopping has become increasingly online. Now, it's not the pandemic that's seen the end to the high street, but it is definitely the pandemic has put two more nails in the high street's coffin in very quick succession because of lockdown, and people getting more and more used to actually thinking about making acquisitions online and having those items delivered to one's house. And in fact, now you hear people complaining bitterly about having to go out and buy something because they're so used to actually having it delivered at home. And that really went to funerals as well. Before the pandemic, it was starting. Silver Surfers were always had been there maybe since about 2015. And people were beginning, because of the lack of I will conform, I will do what everybody else does, because of the lowering of expectation or belief in religion, people were deciding that they really wanted something that was diverse and suited them. They wanted to be offered diverse choice. And they sort of got it into their heads that if they walked down the high street and walked into the first funeral director, they might not be getting such a diverse choice. So they thought, before I go to the funeral director, I will go online and I will look to see what's available. And so by doing that, by looking online and seeing what was available, they suddenly thought, well, some people were determined and motivated to do this from a monetary point of view. Other people from just a choice, having a diverse choice. But some people from a monetary point of view, and they were probably the most likely people to go online, and they were looking for direct cremation because they knew direct cremation was going to cost them £1,000 instead of £4,000 plus for a traditional funeral. So that's what really pushed people to the internet to start with. It was very much direct cremation as opposed to, what sort of traditional funeral can I have? But then more and more, and increasingly so, because people, not everybody, perhaps only 1 in 5 bereaved people making funeral arrangements would like a direct cremation. Probably 4 out of 5 want either a celebration of life service, which will cost £2,000, or maybe a traditional funeral, which will cost £4,000. So, but they actually now know that to get the choice, to make some comparisons, to see what's available, you can do that from the comfort of your own home. And it's probably by actually having their Waitrose or Tesco's shopping done that way that's given them the confidence to actually look at how to do that online when it comes to bereaved family looking to make funeral arrangements.
Very interesting. I often look back at my own recent history in the industry and feel there has been a significant adjustment in people's attitudes towards end-of-life services. It seems younger people have been actively more involved in planning them. The approach to this seems to have altered along with people's choices. Could you expand on this, Howard, perhaps adding how you feel the market needs to change more in the next 5 years?
I think I think, in fact, your observations are absolutely right. I think it's led a little by the fact that, as I've said before, people have a middle-class aspiration and a middle-class attitude of mind that you don't tell me what to do. I will not be told what to do. Whereas up until the 1960s, 70s, until certainly the social revolution or the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, etc., people did exactly what they were told. And now the baby boomers, who never did anything they were told, that these people, the baby boomers, were to be 20, to be 40, to be 60, to be 80, to be dead. The best people are dead because we're the baby boomers. And, there'll never be another band like the Beatles because we're the baby boomers. And the fact is that those people certainly are not going to be told what to do. And because those people started this social revolution, and ever since, religion has been on the decline, and it's now into a state that actually less than 20% of all funerals are taken by a vicar or a priest. And in fact, and if you then took away ethnic minorities, it would be much worse than that. Because those people still, Afro-Caribbeans, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, as well as a lot of Italian or Roman Catholics, etc., still very much have religious services, but the indigenous English population really don't. And that's given them the opportunity to think, well, this is, what do I want in my service? Well, I'd like to have Let It Be, or I'd like to have 75 photos of my father going round on the screen during the service, or I'm going to get up and I'm going to give the eulogy, or I'm going to get a celebrant who will say some prayers if we want them, or he won't if we don't, and he will give the eulogy too. So that's where all of that's coming from. It's not just a monetary thing, it's a thing about we want to be in control. We don't want to do all the work. Yeah, we want to tell somebody what we want, and we want them to do it. I mean, don't get the wrong idea that people suddenly want to do DIY funerals. They don't. They certainly don't want to go off and make coffins or run off to the hospital and pick Dad up and put him in the back of their shooting brake. That's not what they want at all. They do want, though, to control what they're doing. They want what they want. They want to have a say in what it is. They want to have a say in what it costs. And they want to have a say on the way it's going to turn out in the day. And that means that some people want to spend more than the average, some people want to spend a lot less than the average, but what they want to do is spend what they want to spend and not one size fits all. And that's what the industry has got to get into its head.
Much of what we've discussed today suggests that perhaps the landscape has altered from an industry perspective. Many people are aware that the government had looked in some detail at the industry, and during this time many businesses within the industry had already started adjusting their models, perhaps in anticipation of legislation. Could you expand on this, Howard?
Yeah, well, I think actually, happily, the great star in Memoria for dealing with the CMA and talking about the CMA is actually Jameson, and I think he's on one of your later shows, and you could maybe talk to him a bit about that then. But from our perspective and from my personal perspective, the fact is that in about 2016, there was a need to look at this industry because, in fact, the price of funerals had gone up much more than the cost of living. And over a period of about 20 years, the inflation rate in funerals had been such, and it had been driven up by one large firm increasing prices quite significantly each year. And in fact, as a result of that had been followed by the cooperative movements, then had followed by the independents. And so the market was drifting upwards at a much higher rate than inflation year on year. And eventually, Frank Field, the Labour MP, had headed a select committee under the, I think it was the Cameron government, or maybe it was under Mrs. May, that in fact subsequently looked into this and said this is worthy of investigation. However, their investigation found that actually the initial investigation of the Parliamentary Select Committee was in fact actually to find that funerals had gone up by too much, and that deserved, therefore, there to be a CMA investigation into it. The reason that was the case was that you can see when I was a young man as a funeral director, a big funeral director did 1,000 funerals a year and a small one did 200. Today, actually a small one does about 35 and a big one does 200. So it's absolutely totally changed. Why is that? Because you couldn't survive when I was a funeral director, a young man as a funeral director, on less than 200 funerals a year. Today you can survive on 35, and that's because there's the margin in it. Now, as a result of that, the CMA were quite right to be looking at it, but they actually, when it came to trying to resolve it, they couldn't. And it isn't a good thing to legislate. Legislation never, ever sorts anything out. Surely the lessons of, in fact, the Soviet Union and the communist economies, which completely collapsed in the 1990s, tell you that free market economies work. What happened was that actually people suddenly saw this sleepy little back industry called funerals being worth billions of pounds, and came into it as actually online funeral suppliers wanting to sell people pre-arranged funeral plans, etc., etc. And a whole new layer of competition came into the industry. The result is that there is now funeral deflation. The result is that actually, while Victorian funerals have now going up, if at all, they're going up less than inflation. And in fact, there is a whole raft of new products called celebration of life funerals, direct cremations, etc., which bring down the average cost of a funeral. So you can choose what you want, and if you only want to spend £1,000, you can spend £1,000. You don't have to spend £4,000. If you only want to spend £2,000, you can spend £2,000. The free market economy has solved the issue. So there's no need, the government isn't going to legislate, and there's no need, and it would have been a shocking mistake to act. The best way to sort anything out is to make people compete. And then, in fact, they have incentive, they want to win, they become market disruptors. That's the Uber factor in life, whatever. And the situation is that's how you get closure on these problems. And it has happened. There will be no CMA future investigation, I wouldn't think, for at least another decade, because funerals are absolutely curing their own problems by actually giving diversity of choice and some cheaper choices.
Thank you so much, Howard. And I thank you for your valued contribution today. Yet again, it's been an education. Can I thank you for taking the time to listen today to the second of our 6-series episode, The Loss of a Loved One. Our next episode, episode 3, will be about bereavement and grieving, the emotions and the journey having experienced a loss. And I'm delighted to tell you that taking part in this will be some very prominent professional bereavement experts, including Memoria Maddox, whose story about her daughter is truly moving, Laura Toop, a very experienced grief counsellor who experienced her own personal loss at a very young age. Laura will also join us. For further information or to ask any questions on today's discussion, please contact me directly via LinkedIn or at memoria.org.uk. These podcasts are free to listen to via Amazon, YouTube and Spotify, and for further information please contact me directly. Thank you for listening today.